the Dementia Researcher Podcast, talking careers, research, conference highlights, and so much more.
Hello and welcome to the Dementia Researcher Podcast. Today we're talking about wandering in care homes, drawing on a National Institute for Health Research funded study, reframing wandering as a meaningful activity. Wandering is a term that is used widely in care homes and in dementia care. It is often associated with risk, safeguarding concerns, and anxiety for staff and families. At the same time, many people walk for meaningful reasons, whether that is habit, comfort, restlessness, or a need that is difficult to express in other ways. This episode looks at how research is challenging the idea that wandering is simply a problem to manage, and instead asks how care homes can support walking in ways that protect safety while also respecting autonomy and quality of life. Now, I'm joined by three guests who bring together research, evidence synthesis, and frontline care experience. First, Dr. Bryony Waters-Harvey, who is a researcher involved in National Institute for Health Research, so NIHR funded work, exploring how care homes understand and respond to wandering, including the Research for Social Care study that sits behind today's discussion. We're also joined by Emma Hock, who is also from the University of Sheffield, whose work focuses on evidence synthesis and understanding how complex interventions work in real-world settings. And finally, we're joined by Conny McGowan, Head of Care at Heart's Home House and Orders of St John's Care Trust Care Home. Conny began her career as a carer and now leads care practice within a home rated outstanding by the Care Quality Commission. She brings invaluable insights from day-to-day dementia care. Now, before I welcome our guests, I should also mention who I am. My name is Dr. Anna Volkmann. I'm a speech and language therapist with 25 years of clinical experience, often working in care homes and meeting people who are wandering and talking to staff who are having difficulties managing this. So I'm really excited to host this podcast today. Thank you all for joining me. Hi, Bryony. Hi, Emma. Hi, Conny.
Hi.
Hello.
So to start us off, could I ask each of you to introduce yourselves, please? How about Bryony? Do you want to go first?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm a postdoctoral research at the University of Sheffield, and I've got several years of working on care home research, and a lot of my research kind of came out of what I learned while I was a wellbeing therapist at a care home.
Fantastic. I think that's often happens, doesn't it? A lot of my research came out of my clinical experience, which I think is why I love these kind of podcasts, because we talk about clinical experience and how that influences research. Perhaps we could come to Conny next. Could you introduce yourself, Conny?
Yes, so I've worked with the Orders of St John Care Trust for about 20 years now. I've been at Heart's Home House for about 13 years as head of care. We are a 43-bedded care home. We have residents living with dementia and also residents who are residential.
Wowza, that's huge. And Emma, an introduction from you.
Yes, I am Dr. Emma Hock. I'm a senior lecturer in public health at the University of Sheffield, and my research work focuses pretty much entirely on evidence synthesis methods, and I also teach on the Masters of Public Health course.
Wonderful, welcome. So why wandering is such a difficult issue? That's what we're here to discuss. As we've already touched on during the introduction, wandering, it's often an issue for people who reside in care homes, but can also be an issue for people living at home still. I should make that really clear. So perhaps, Bryony, we can start with you. Could you tell us what is wandering in care homes and what made it feel like an important issue to focus on?
Yeah, so I guess the official kind of terminology of what wandering is that it's a meaningless act of movement for people with dementia. But for us, actually, we see wandering just as any form of walking in the home. And as you've mentioned, that's not always aimless. There's also a lot of positive reasons for that. So for us, it was just about actually people that like to walk frequently. And this research really came from actual care staff. So we have our principal investigator, Alice Griffiths, was a researcher in a care home. So she was working in one specific care home. And the staff said that they really wanted to support people to walk safely, but actually they didn't really know how to do that. So they would normally go to the kind of strategies of telling people to sit down and try and moving people away from unsafe areas. So they wanted us to kind of create some sort of guideline to actually help people be able to allow people to walk and stop saying sit down.
Fascinating. Thank you. It's such a challenge. I know as a clinician, I've experienced people being at the door of a care home and even struggling to get into a care home. And then when people are trying to leave, it can be really difficult if people are just right there, wandering right at the door. So I can see there's lots of challenges. So, Emma, is there already a lot of research on this topic out there?
Yes, there is quite a bit of research. As we found, it focuses more on certain areas than others, and there were some aspects that we were actually focusing on where we found very little research. For example, there isn't much research on helping to support residents with hydration and nutrition while they're walking. However, there is a lot of research on strategies to, as Bryony mentioned, prevent people from wandering or limit their wandering. And there is quite a bit of research on strategies that could potentially support wandering, but that could also be used to limit wandering, depending on how they're implemented.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. I have a vivid memory of working with a family because as a speech therapist, we do a lot of swallowing work, and we had a lady who was very, very thin and nobody could work out how to maintain her weight. And she was wandering, she was burning so many calories and wouldn't sit down. It's a real challenge. I can see that. And I guess we've already started talking about practice, but Conny, could you tell us, bringing this into practice, what does wandering tend to represent in a day-to-day setting within a care home? Tell us about that.
So when you come into the care home, you'll always probably find a couple of lounges, and you'll see that majority of the residents are sat down and engaging in conversations amongst themselves, doing activities, but you will always have a small number of individuals that just like to walk around. They're either along the corridors, they'll either be at the front door, they'll either be at the garden door, they might follow staff members into the kitchen or the laundry, or they'll go into other people's bedrooms. So it's really these individuals that we as a team have to keep an eye on, and really the main thing is always keeping everyone safe. So a lot of residents as well that do like to walk around a lot are actually high risk of falls. So you have that constantly on your mind. Are they going to be falling? Are they safe just walking around? So it is that kind of pressure that you feel.
So the risk that we haven't really talked about the risks yet, but yeah, the risk of falling. What about the risk of kind of absconding, I guess we used to call it, but it's perhaps sounds very harsh, but them getting out and wandering off?
Absolutely. I mean, I do always feel that we are very high security here. So we have all our doors have got codes, so residents can't just leave, but that doesn't stop them from asking to leave. And we now have a very quick response rather than saying, no, you can't. Someone will put a coat on, take their mobile phone, and we will just go for a walk with them. And usually by the time you get to the end of the drive, they realize that they haven't really thought this through very well. And usually I go for a little walk with them, and I always make a suggestion, shall we not go back and maybe plan a bit about where we're actually going, and seeing you haven't got a bus pass, you haven't got any money. So, and then they say, all right, then we'll go back. So, and sometimes it's that feeling of they wanted to really get out, and now that's out of their system, they do become a bit more settled.
So interesting. I can imagine that working well in certain environments and not others. So wards where you perhaps are embedded in a bigger building. It's such a tricky thing, isn't it? Managing that. But also, do you find that people get distressed if you can't deal with, like, if they're wanting to get out?
Absolutely. They do get very distressed. And sometimes that's the whole point, that we kind of invest those 10, 15 minutes, even 20 minutes, take that resident out and then the rest of the shift will be a lot more smoothly. So it's always thinking about, right, how can I use my time wisely? And usually it works. It doesn't always work, but it's worth just investing that bit of time for that resident, because in the long run it'll pay off.
It's interesting how we talk about it with our medical hats on. It's all about risk and the kind of negative consequences and the challenges. But I can see that actually that wandering can also, if we can reinterpret it in a different light, then we could maybe think about it differently. Thank you for that, Conny. Now that we understand what wandering is, I'd like to get into thinking a little bit about our understanding of this. Bryony, your work challenges the idea that wandering is meaningless. Why does language matter so much in this space?
So again, we were very much guided by the care homes over the last sort of 2 years, and even before that, since this project's kind of been developed. We've had a lot of debates with academics, with care staff, with just the general public about this term wandering. It seems to be kind of, if you're a younger person and you're using this term about, I don't know, going for a wander on a Sunday afternoon, it's seen as that leisurely activity where you haven't really got any direction or purpose, but that's okay. You're doing it for the enjoyment of walking. But when it comes to dementia and care homes, it automatically has this negative connotation that is a symptom of the dementia or it needs to be stopped. Where for us, actually, when we're walking with these people that we've been working with, a lot of the time it's not part of their dementia. It's just their life. They're potentially bored, or they're always walked. They've kind of grown up. We've had people that have grown up kind of as postmen or as nurses, so are used to walking, and now we're putting them into a care home where they have a lot of their independence taken away because of needing support to care, and also trying to take away their walking. So for us, it was very much kind of making sure that every staff member and every care home was happy with the terminology. So actually, as the project has developed, we do still use wandering, but we've actually moved away from wandering at the same time to use other words. So a lot of the time on all of our documents now, we just use walking, because that is what, at the end of the day, these people are doing. But we've also had care homes that like walking with purpose or exploring or venturing. So for us, it was really important to make sure that language mattered, because it was what people felt comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I've had that experience. I used to work on a ward in South London, and I vividly remember this guy, and they kept saying, he's absconding. He'd get out the ward and he'd run. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't walking. He was running. And it took a couple of weeks, but everyone was really stressed about it. And then suddenly his daughter arrived and he said, yeah, no, he was a award-winning boxer, and he'd had this lifelong exercise routine. And then she put all these pictures up on his wall, and suddenly it was much, that narrative then became much easier to talk about. And actually we put in place, we got the ward managed to get some funding for an exercise physiologist to go for a run with him, because the staff, there weren't enough runners on the team to go running with him. But it's so important, isn't it? Thank you, Bryony. That was a really great, useful description. Emma, so let's think about the evidence. So I believe you reviewed the evidence on this topic. Did you find much about the kinds of assumptions, and or maybe I should rephrase that, what kinds of assumptions did you notice in how wandering was framed in the research studies?
Yeah, so as Bryony mentioned, the overwhelming majority of research framed it as negative, and we actually didn't focus on that research so much, because we were interested in research that looked at how wandering could be supported. But even so, in a lot of that evidence, wandering was often framed as a negative thing, and we did manage to draw out some evidence relating to approaches that can help people to wander safely, such as, for example, controlling entrances and exits to enable people to wander freely within a space without entering a space that might be dangerous. However, a lot of the language within the studies was still be talking about limiting people's wandering behaviour and so on. And it's very interesting talking about the examples of the box that you just mentioned, because a lot of the literature actually we looked at was what you call qualitative evidence, so sort of very sort of rich descriptions of people's experiences and accounts. And there were loads of stories like that in the evidence, such as people who everyday lives involve wandering. So it was kind of framed as well, sort of fairly normatively, in terms of that, and how Steph can help us by doing that very process of understanding exactly what walking means in that person's life, or any kind of movement really. It's funny, we did look at mostly academic literature, journal articles and so on, but we also included what we call grey literature, which is stuff that the everyday person might access on the internet. So we had a few blog posts which were posted by care agencies, and the language in those was a lot more positive around wandering.
That's fascinating. So that's really interesting, isn't it? That just a different type of literature described it quite differently. How interesting. Thank you. Conny, what are if you have staff members, particularly newer staff members, do staff make assumptions about people's walking that are negative, or do they tend to make positive assumptions? Tell us a bit more about that.
I think if you have new carers, there is definitely that assumption as to, are they safe to walk around? Should I tell them to sit down? But I would say that we're in a quite fortunate position that we have got a very experienced team here at the care home. So as a team as a whole, housekeepers, they may see someone and then ask them if they want a cloth and wipe down the handrails, give them something to do, because like Bryony said as well, it is often that they want to be helpful, they want to be doing something, a lot of people have had very busy lives, so for them to just suddenly stop and just unwind, it's difficult. So it's involving residents, even the carers. I see them asking the resident to push the trolley round, to collecting cups and things like that. So I think we are very fortunate here that we see residents walking about, that what can we do with them?
Yeah, be purposeful. Yeah. Do you think it matters, the number of staff matter? Do you think if you have a day when you're a bit understaffed, does that make it all harder?
It does. And again, as I mentioned before, sometimes you have to just kind of think about the situation. If you have a resident he is very unsettled, he's very high at risk of falls. So personally, if I was leading the shift, I would just say I would allocate one carer to keep an eye on that resident, because he might be the one triggering everyone else to be unsettled. So I would say, can you take this gentleman down to the lounge? And that way, I think everyone's time is spent better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, really useful. Okay, thank you. Well, next, let's move on to talk more about your research. So this study was funded through the NIHR Research for Social Care programme. Bryony, obviously we know this study is not about wandering, but could talk us through that in more detail, what the study set out to explore and why this focus felt important.
Yeah. So our main goal was to develop some form of guidance to support care staff to be able to support people to walk safely in the care home without having to restrict them. And we felt it was really, really important, because at the end of the day, our research team is very much about wanting to improve the lives of people with dementia and allowing them to continue to be able to be independent and have a fulfilled life while they're in their care homes. And we felt that this was one topic that really needed to be focused on. And as Emma's mentioned, a lot of the research that was out there was more towards that negative, trying to restrict people than support them. So we had 3 phases of the overall project. So we had the realist review that I'll leave for Emma to explain, as I'm definitely not an expert on that methodology. But then we had our observation study. So we got to go into 6 care homes and just spend, I think it was about 2 months across kind of about 14 hours with each resident, and just getting to walk around with them, seeing where they went, kind of if they shared why they were walking, see how staff supported them, and looking at kind of how different care homes are able to support people, or maybe those areas where staff struggle. 'Cause all staff don't want to restrict residents. They're just, as Conny was saying, that fear of the falling or the leaving the care home or the other risks that are associated. They don't know how they can manage that with giving people independence. And then our final phase was actually co-developing that guidance booklet. So we worked with staff and managers in care homes to create some form of booklet that took all of the work from the review and the observation studies to be able to provide people with those strategies and a bit more understanding of how they could support people safely.
It's really interesting. Bryony, you said you're right. People don't want to restrict people, do they? I think sometimes when I've been in clinical settings and people it does happen very occasionally, people get out of a ward unsupervised, and we have had, in settings I've worked in, we once or twice have had to call the police, and the way the staff treat it is often kind of, we need another study, let's do another study. But I know sometimes like the conversations I've had, people are kind of like, oh, this is an awful thing, but also it's not only awful. I remember this gentleman, he ended up, he was found, but he'd been fishing, and he'd been fishing in a suit. It was a very amazing story, but he'd obviously had a wonderful time. There'd obviously been heaps of risks, but then the narrative in the staff, we didn't want to restrict him, but it was like a conflict. It's really, I feel like there's a whole other study there as you're talking. Speaking of studies, Emma, your study used a realist approach. I've heard a lot about realist approaches. I've not used it. I'd love to use it. For me and the listeners who are unfamiliar with this methodology, could you tell us, what does a realist study help us understand that other methodologies might miss?
Okay, so it is quite complex, but in a nutshell, realist approach helps you to sort of work out what's actually going on. It focuses on the mechanisms behind what's happening. So in this case, how and why the strategies that have been described in the literature to help people to wander safely were actually improving people's well-being and enabling them to walk and also remain safe. And also, there's a bit of a focus on the context. So what is it about the environment or the person or the situation, the staff, the culture of the care home, the physical environment in the care home that would then sort of activate the mechanisms, which is the sort of the underlying what's going on, how is this working, in order to be able to lead to, say, a resident being happy, satisfied, not agitated, to staff being not anxious about their well-being, and to the resident being kept safe. So essentially it's in synthesis, which is what we did for the first part of the study. In synthesis, this looks like gathering lots of evidence, but you're not just looking at, what's happening, which you might do in, say, a systematic review. You're not looking at, say, which strategies are effective for helping people to run safely. You're looking at how, why, for whom, and in which circumstances.
Does it go to the granular level, or can it capture some of the granular stuff that, say, like what I'm thinking about a conversation analytics study that I'm quite familiar with, where they did look at wandering or people walking around and how the staff assigned to that person verbally interacted and what was said that perhaps made the situation more difficult and what was said that perhaps made that situation easier. Can it capture that kind of granular level as well, or is it perhaps a bit more umbrella-y? I'm just pondering.
Yeah, so this was a challenge that we had, actually, because we ended up looking at quite a few different sort of strategies and the mechanisms behind them. And we did this with perhaps, maybe we looked at too many for the sort of the scope of the project, but we did cover a lot of evidence. So we began to look at everything in detail. So myself, Bryony, and a few others, we pulled out the rich data from the papers. As I mentioned, actually all of the evidence was qualitative in the end. That wasn't by design, it was the way it worked out, but actually, as you said, qualitative evidence, evidence where the data is people's descriptions, experiences, accounts, and so on, does give a lot of detail, which helps to kind of explain some of the hows and whys. And so we spent a lot of time, didn't we, Bryony, getting all of this data out of the papers and into a sort of a format that we could then use. And then all of this data was sort of looked through in detail, and how it related to sort of context and mechanisms was pulled out of it. So we did begin with a lot of detail, but we realised that to produce something that would fit the word count of a journal, we had to reduce some of that detail and try and obviously make some recommendations as well that could be implemented in care homes, and it could carry forward to the next stage of the research, the actual getting into the care homes and watching what was going on, speaking to people. So we did have to sort of remove quite a bit of the detail from the actual write-up in the end, but it all went in there. So yes, to answer your question, we did go into the granularity of it, although some of that may eventually have been unfortunately lost in the write-up. But in realist approaches, you could look at, say, a small number of questions and then explore those in greater detail. So it's not a function of the method, it's just the size of the evidence that we were looking at.
Hear what you're saying. So did the second stage, the observational stage that you described, Bryony, also use realist methods? And did you use realist methods to join that together, or how did that work?
Yes, so the realist review informed our second part of the study. So we took, as Emma mentioned, we reduced all that information down and came up with sort of 5 main areas that we focused on, which was sort of personal care, monitoring, access to spaces, food and drink, and safety and comfortability, if I remember rightly. So yeah, kind of what we took for that was our basis. So we looked at, okay, are these things really being kind of translated into practice? And yeah, looking at was I guess kind of still following that, when do these strategies work and for who? So I guess, yeah, it was more, we did ethnography methods for this, but very much was informed by the realist approach. In another part of the study, we completed an environmental mapping. We had a occupational therapist that joined our research team at the start of the project, and she was really interested in how the environment of the care homes could impact on the behaviour of wandering. So as part of her role within the project, she developed the wayfinding tool, which is an 80-item tool that describes the environment relating to that act of orientation and wayfinding. And this looked across 11 different areas of the care homes, such as exits, corridors, fire safety, and the various different rooms that you might find in a care home, such as bedrooms. And this tool used quantitative and qualitative methods to look at how that environment was set up. So we looked at the layout of the care home, where the corridors were, visual access, looking at was there visual access from the bedroom to the toilet to help with wayfinding. She also used measurements, so she measured the width of corridors to see if they were suitable for how people could pass in the corridors or people in wheelchairs. We used a tape measure to measure the length to find out what the longest route was in each care home from the bedroom to the communal areas. there was also measurement of chairs and tables to see if they are suitable for residents to be able to independently sit and stand themselves. And in each care home, we went round and completed this 80-item tool to get an overview of what that care home's environment looked like. And from what we found in that part of the study, actually, this was really important because each care home was so different that it really helped to contextualize the observation results in the context of each care home. So we're really hoping that by developing this tool, we're going to make it available to other researchers that are interested in using it. And we hope that in future studies, people may consider creating a conceptual environmental mapping of care homes when looking at a behaviour to see how the environment interacts with that behaviour that's being studied. And we also hope that this tool could be used by care homes to audit their care homes to see what areas of the environment could be changed to improve wandering and wayfinding. And we found that this wasn't about kind of saying what was wrong or what wasn't. It was to really just look at that conceptual idea and how that interacted with the behaviour.
Okay. And then out of those packages came a set of recommendations. Is that what?
Yes. So we took all of the findings from the first phase, all of the findings from the second phase, and we took them to the staff and managers that signed up to the co-production workshops and said, this is what we found. These seem to be strategies that are possible. So obviously we had very different care homes. So some care homes were like, no, those strategies would never work in our care homes. We had others that were very much more kind of accessible. Like we had some places where the whole care home was accessible to everyone and people were allowed a lot more freedom because of the format of where it was and the buildings, where obviously a lot of these are not purpose-built buildings, so are very restricted. So we took everything we had and said, look, what do you think out of these are doable, are safe, and are most kind of possible? And as a group of 30 staff, we was able to actually come up with kind of 3 or 4 strategies for each of those elements that could be practically inputted into care homes. I should probably talk about the strategies that have come out of this research that have been included in the booklets. So we found 7 areas of kind of residents' needs that we wanted to look at. And within each of those areas, we asked care staff to pick their top 2 to 3 most important strategies. So some that were quite important to us was in area 1 is knowing each resident as an individual. So we feel it's really important to understand each resident and what strategies they need for that individual based on their life history, their abilities, their needs, and kind of anything that the staff learn about residents during that time. So 2 strategies that were quite important in this area was creating individualised care plans. And as part of that, we've developed care plan prompts to make sure that staff are covering all areas when it comes to supporting people to wander. So this is kind of looking at life history and understanding how that could influence how people decide to walk, why they walk, looking at kind of walking preferences, looking at if there's any triggers to understand when a resident is wanting to walk for enjoyment rather than when maybe they're walking due to an unmet need or due to anxiety. And looking at kind of what support they need. So whether they need tailored walking aids, if they need someone to walk with them. And as part of that as well, it's looking at kind of reporting incidences and near misses to make sure that you can support residents to continue to walk safely. So if there's residents in certain areas that don't get on, how that can be supported to make sure that all residents can walk in the same space. Another really important strategy for us is residents taking part in meaningful activities. So we found that a lot of residents walk because they want to find something meaningful to do. So being able to offer either meaningful activities such as music, exercise, dance, baking can be really helpful. Also allowing residents to take part in household tasks that they enjoy is a really great way to allow people to walk meaningfully and allow them to have that purpose. So some of these household tasks can be such as setting, cleaning tables, dusting, folding laundry, kind of things that are very regular for people to do while walking. Another area that was important to us was safe and comfortable movement. So the main strategy for this is providing physical and emotional support. So while some residents may be able to walk independently without any assistance, it is important to offer physical support for residents that maybe need that additional help to be able to move around the care home, but also kind of hand holding and guiding hands on backs can also be a reassurance for residents, especially for those that maybe have a fear of falling. And similarly with the emotional support, offering verbal directions on bending your knees or turning this way can provide that reassurance to residents that they're safe and supported. Another strategy is using tailored walking aids. So with the support of healthcare professionals, working out whether when mobility changes, whether tailored walking aids can allow residents to continue to have that independence. And then those that do have walking aids, it's about making sure that residents are using them and providing calm and positive communication to support them to use those aids. And we found in many care homes that personalisation was really important to make sure that residents are using the correct walking aids. So this could be having their name put on the front, having a picture that's associated with that residence, or having different colours to help them identify them easily. Not only was we interested in wandering, but we was also interested in wayfinding or navigating the care homes. And there was a number of strategies for this, such as using appropriate lighting, so making sure that areas are well lit and that it's natural light rather than harsh lighting that can cause glare or discomfort, making sure that there is an elimination of dark shadows or kind of confusing glares off of different materials that could cause trips and falls, and looking at whether lighting needs to be changed depending on the time of day, so gently dimming the lights as the night goes on to stimulate the difference between day and night. Managing access was a big area for us. So this was about keeping spaces clean, arranging furniture that gives wide, clear walking paths and making sure that those walking paths are kept clear of any equipment or furniture, making sure that flooring is even and dry with no loose mats or cables, and making sure that staff report to management and maintenance when there is potential hazards within the space. There was also kind of looking at restricting access to unsafe areas. So by locking areas to unsafe areas, this actually can support more wandering in the areas that are safe. So this was about running risk assessments on the residents that are in the care home to look at what areas can safely be left unlocked and what areas need locking. And this could be through PIN codes or kind of gates on stairwells. And this really looked at kind of the needs of the residents at that time, and reassessing when residents' needs change to make sure that it is always the least restrictive environment. And when you do have areas that are locked, looking at using redirecting residents, so trying to acknowledge where their feelings, but then use that information that you know about the residents to guide them to a safe alternative activity or area. The final area that I want to discuss is food and drink. So residents that walk frequently can experience a large amount of weight loss due to not getting enough nutrition and hydration. So we found it was really important that snacks are available all day and night, and making sure that staff are regularly encouraging residents to drink and eat. And we found one way that this could be done is through hydration stations. So placing visually appealing hydration stations in key communal areas can help residents to access that drink on their own. And in terms of snack, offering finger foods and grazing menus that residents can take on the go can be really helpful, as it means that they can walk and eat at the same time. So some of these foods could be sandwiches, cheese sticks, or sliced fruit. And we found it was really about being creative. So choosing ways to serve food that's easy to eat on the go, such as soup in takeaway cups, or using snack belts that staff wear to easily distribute those snacks. So we're hoping to have our final output ready in the next couple of weeks. It is currently just with our graphic designer making it look nice. So we've ended up with 2 booklets. So we've got one for care staff and one for managers that explains those strategies. So each page is a separate one of those themes, and then they've got several strategies that explains what could be implemented. And then alongside those booklets, we've got a resource pack that's going to have a number of kind of practical support tools for staff. So we've got sort of a checklist, we've got training prompts, we've got little stories of different characters that we've created that can allow care homes to kind of discuss these strategies and just actually wandering in a wider concept. We've got care plan prompts to help make sure that actually staff know these strategies and know what works for each resident. And then we've also got a poster to advertise it. We've also been really lucky as well that we got some extra funding to work with another one of our projects to create a comic book. And one of the stories within our comic book is exploring how to give people the independence to wander and focusing on some of those strategies.
Conny, from your perspective, you were involved in all of this. What did it mean to be involved in research like this?
I thought it was a fantastic opportunity, especially because we have quite a few residents that do like to walk around. And for us as a home, we just needed to know really whether we're doing things right, how we can do things better. We're always looking to improve ourselves, and how this research can benefit our residents. Whichever research we do, we always think, how will the residents benefit from this? So yes, it was a great opportunity.
Well, I'm going to move on to talk about, I mean, we've already jumped ahead and talked about how the outputs from the findings, but I want to focus on that in a bit more detail. I expect a strong message from this study is going to be that walking is often meaningful. So Emma and Bryony, I wonder, how do you envisage that your research will change how wandering is understood in care homes?
I guess for us, it's just raising that awareness. We had 6 amazing care homes that were all very much wanting to support wandering, but unfortunately there are many care homes out there that aren't aware of the positives of walking. And unfortunately in a care home I used to work in, it was a lot more restrictive. So we're really hoping to push these outcomes out as far as possible to try and reach as many people, to get the message out and just show that people can continue to walk. And there is a number of strategies. I think it's amazing as well, something that I think none of us in the team really thought about was actually wandering doesn't need to be someone walking around on their feet. We had many of residents that actually are in wheelchairs and still continue to wander, and staff have found ways to allow those residents to independently take themselves around the care home in their wheelchair. And I think that was something we never envisioned would come out of this research.
Amazing. Conny, do you feel that the research itself and the findings match up with what you see in your own care home?
Yes, I'd like to think so. When we went through the booklets, or the booklet at the time, it was confirming that what we are doing is pretty close to what is in the booklet. Just the sessions we had as well with meeting other care home managers and carers, I certainly learned a few things just talking to others and finding out how they manage this behavior. So yes, it was confirming that we are doing things right. But like I said, always room for improvement.
And I guess even that it's interesting you talk about confirmatory. I think with my kind of behavior change hat on, we know that actually if you name a behavior or a strategy, then you know what it is and you can do more of it. So actually I can see that even that is valuable for some of the homes perhaps where things are happening well. But supporting walking does raise ethical issues. I think it's interesting you talk about wheelchair access, because that's a kind of an ethical issue. And I've been talking about, this idea of people getting out. It's tricky in care homes to balance safety with dignity and autonomy, often when there are really limited resources, aren't there? Conny, how do you tackle this? And can research like this help others and be translated into kind of supporting autonomy and being ethical?
So over the last few years, I think we've really changed our approach to something called positive risk taking.
Yes.
So residents are living with dementia, but that doesn't mean we need to restrict things, and we have to, rather than just keep thinking about things that can go wrong, think about the person and think about, if they didn't have dementia, would they still be able to, drink a bottle of wine or something like
Exactly.
that? So it is about just changing our approach and really thinking about that person, because sometimes residents do come to us that have previously been in a care home where the care home couldn't manage, and yet we find them a pleasure to be around and really they're lovely to have in the home and part of our community. So other homes can definitely take a lot from this research.
Thank you. I like the phrase positive risk taking. It's a great way of describing things, because we all take risks all the time. Why should a diagnosis stop you? I think you're absolutely right. It's almost a brilliant summary. But there's lots more research that needs to be done. So Emma, what needs to happen next in terms of evidence and guidance?
Well, so I'll invite Bryony to sort of jump in afterwards, because she was much more involved in the ethnography study and the care home side of things. But in terms of sort of evidence gaps that we've identified, certainly there needs to be more research on how relatives of residents in care homes, how they're sort of involved in supporting their resident in the care home to wander safely, and also there didn't seem to be much research on how strategies work to enable residents to wander safely when there are several different residents in the care home all at the same time with different needs walking around. There also needs to be some more longitudinal research, which is research that's taken over a long time period, sort of looking at how everything works sort of over the longer term, how residents and staff and relatives negotiate some of these issues of safety and care preferences and preferences for walking. And also there could be some more research on sort of staffing and shift patterns in terms of how that affects the support that residents are able to receive, which I know was mentioned quite early on in this podcast. And there could also be, I know there's a lot of qualitative evidence and it's extremely useful for sort of understanding exactly what's going on. There could be also some more quantitative evidence looking at the effectiveness of some of these strategies, which we brought together and we didn't find an awful lot of, just to sort of complement the qualitative evidence. Bryony, it'd be really useful actually to have your insights from the ethnography as to what research needs to be taking place.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Emma. Relatives would be really interesting. So we did plan on recruiting relatives, but this was the only participant type that we really struggled to recruit. So it would be really interesting to see more about kind of relatives and how they can support, but also kind of their beliefs on allowing people to wander. We had many people say that sometimes there is this challenge between what the care home want to implement because they know it's what's best for the resident, but then that relative having that fear of not wanting their relative to fall or escape or be harmed. So I think that would be something that's really interested. And I think the quantitative is definitely something that needs to, we was fully qualitative as well. So we was able to kind of suggest these strategies, but actually how much they relate to kind of reducing anxiety and distress, and kind of that how much does giving that independence stop people from leaving would be really interesting, I think. And my final point would be about kind of access to gardens. So we had some care homes that very much did give free access to residents, and they could go into that garden at any time of the day without sort of any supervision. But then we have other care homes that was very restricted and either let no one into the garden at all, or it had to be supervised. And there's other research out on this that actually a lot of care homes do go more towards that restricting of access. And I think it'd be really interesting to explore that further on actually if some of the strategies that we've seen in these care homes that are freely open, can they be implemented everywhere and allow that freedom to everyone? Because I think that was something that kind of really struck me during the research, that actually some of these residents, they might never get to go outside again. They might not kind of, I guess we take it for granted that we can feel rain or we can feel the sun, but actually some of these residents never get to experience that again once they go into a care home.
So we're almost out of time, but to finish, I would like to ask each of you one final question. So the question is, what is one common myth about wandering that you would like people to stop repeating? Bryony, do you want to go first? Should we go alphabetically?
I guess the biggest thing for me is that it isn't a meaningless activity for these people. They have a purpose why they're walking, and it is beneficial for them. And we shouldn't just be saying, sit down, it's not safe. We should be supporting them to walk safely.
Conny?
Yes, very similar to Bryony's answer, and she mentioned something in the beginning as well. I think that wandering in a care home has got that negative connotations, but I think we should see this wandering, walking around as an opportunity really to have that moment with the resident, to engage them in a conversation, to interact with them on a one-to-one basis. So really it can be something very positive as well.
Just from looking at the evidence, allowing people to wander takes up more staff time and convenience, because the evidence suggested that actually allowing people to wander safely can actually take up a bit less time than constantly having to, say, redirect somebody or something like that. But I don't know if that chimes with your experience, Conny.
Well, this has been such a wonderful discussion. Thank you. I think just to summarize, I think what I'm hearing is that we're talking about wandering or walking being a meaningful activity that makes people human, and that actually could, if we had the right strategies in place, could reduce resource use, improve quality of care, and allow people positive risk-taking, which is something human we all do. Thank you so much to Dr. Bryony Waters-Harvey, Dr. Emma Hock, and Conny McGowan for sharing their experience and perspectives today, and listening to some of mine. I'm sorry, I've been inserting mine in there too. Links to the NIHR Research for Social Care study and related resources will be included in the show notes. Thank you all for listening. I'm Anna Volkmar, and you've been listening to the Dementia Researcher Podcast. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
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 The Dementia Researcher Podcast was brought to you by University College London with generous funding from the UK National Institute for Health Research, Alzheimer's Research UK, Alzheimer's Society, Alzheimer's Association, and Race Against Dementia. Please subscribe, leave us a review, and register on our website for full access to all our great resources. dementiaresearcher.nihr.ac.uk